Thank you to Edmund calling us up the hill to this sacred time and space. And thank you to Isaac and Emily for guiding our steps as we enter, and to Jane for accompanying our songs tonight. Thanks to all of you for coming up the hill. Welcome and blessings of this evening hour to every actual body and to everybody joining us through the miracle of the streaming through that camera back there in the corner. And I'd like to invite you to take a moment, if you will, and just turn. I happened to get a text message a few moments ago that my significant other is on that camera saying, "I see you." So could everybody just turn and wave at least to Frank and anybody else who is there? Thank you. It's not just a figment of our imagination, right? Okay, so first things first, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Am I intelligible so far?
Yes.
Okay. You know, I recently joined the club of folks who wear these little computer things behind their ears, surreptitiously tucked there, called hearing aids. And so I'm newly tuned in to the issue of sound quality. And I'm going to do my best to use my outside voice. I can't see you all that well, but if you don't hear me well enough, just give me a signal of some kind. So in this morning's Beacon, I wrote an article that sort of sets this service in a little bit of historical context. And if you haven't had time to look at it, this is a quick summary of the countless ways I've been involved in Iris on Star Island over the past, 40 years or so. The only other candlelight service I led was exactly 40 years ago this summer, 1986. It was the first thing that I did in Iris, and it was at the very beginning of my work in parish ministry. So I've resisted doing another candlelight again for 40 years. Because first, as a real early bird, I usually don't stay up this late. And second, because here you are basically trying to lead a service in the dark when I can't really see your faces, so I don't know how you're reacting, and etc. But that service 40 years ago changed my life, my future, in ways I never could have imagined at the time, as I hinted in that article. And so I decided that I probably could manage to do two within 40 years. But I also decided to do something that I almost never have done before, and that is to pull not a whole sermon out of the barrel, but a portion of one out of the barrel, as they say, from that one back in 1986. So, true confession. Tonight's reflection is a kind of warp and woof of 1986 and 2026. And I think I have it right, that that's 40 years, right? I did the math right. Okay, so I'd like to open with a unison reading by Robert French Levins and our hymn with words from John Greenleaf Whittier. And let's join together for our reading, followed by the hymn. Let us read together. Holy and beautiful, the custom which brings us together in the presence of the Most High, to face our ideals, to remember our loved ones in absence, to give thanks, to make confession, to offer forgiveness, to be enlightened, and to be strengthened. Through this quiet hour breathes the worship of ages, the cathedral music of history. Three unseen guests attend. Let all and love, let all our hearts prepare them place. Okay. Occasionally, I stop to wonder about what brings me to this island, but more specifically to the Iris Conference on Star Island. Often what brings me is not what ends up touching or transforming me most. Often why I come is sort of quietly set aside by the surprise of spiritual experience. Often the plans I make, the knowing I seek, is met instead by the knowing of faith, hope, and love. Take note, friends, often why you come to this island, what brings you in the first place to the Iris Conference on Star Island, creates a future that is quite a bit more than you ever could have expected. That is, in 1953, when I was 9 years old, my parents brought me, along with my kid brother Mark and my maternal grandmother named Blanche Johns. As a 2-year-old, I had declared that she would be called Mega, M-E-G-A, and so it was by all who loved her until her dying day. I came to Star Island in 1953 seeking to know, finally, my childhood images of what it would be to have some fun and adventure in life. My seminary president father was the sole speaker for a UCC Church Week, billed in a brochure that I found here in the archives in Vaughan Cottage as the Vacation Conference with a Purpose. That tells you everything you need to know about that week. The 5 of us stayed in the stone cottage out back, just called the parsonage, just beyond Newton, where the chaplain for the week typically stays, and where I now have been blessed to stay for the Iris Week, perhaps 5 times in 40 years. My liberal father, however, did not have enough faith to let me go anywhere near the water, anywhere near those gorgeous rocky cliffs out back on the island, anywhere out of his sight, actually. And so I spent much of the week on the porch of the hotel, rocking in what were then all green rockers with Mega, playing canasta, as she warmly invited me to join her and her new cronies, patiently teaching me their card game. If it's true, as some say, that all a kid really needs to grow up is just one person's unconditional love, my Mega was it. In 1983, when I was 39 years old, a change of career from special ed to Unitarian Universalist Parish Ministry brought me here for the UU Religious Education Week. I came seeking to expand my studies at Harvard Divinity School in faith development theory, as elucidated by people like James Fowler, Carol Gilligan, Robert Keegan, Lawrence Kohlberg, Piaget, and other luminaries in the field. I spent most of that week, however, out back on the rocks, climbing the highest, most dangerous cliffs I could find and swimming in the polar bear ocean. Well, the next trip I made to Star Island in 1984 was for the Iris Week. That time, reading, you've heard about him a lot this week, reading sociobiologist E.O. Wilson's 1978 book on human nature brought me here. And this is the specific paragraph, and this is the specific book that did it. Quote, "The mental processes and ritual activity of religious belief represent programmed predispositions whose self-sufficient components were incorporated into the neural apparatus of the brain by thousands of generations of genetic evolution. As such, they are powerful, ineradicable, and at the center of human social existence. At the time that I was a student at Harvard Divinity School, in spite of its Unitarian heritage, the only course in theology that seemed even moderately relevant for me was one taught by Christian theologian Gordon Kaufman, known for his ideas about constructing a concept of God and God as serendipitous creativity. We read E.O. Wilson for that course, but in the section with a teaching fellow, she presented Wilson in juxtaposition as negating most any kind of theological reflection. Why, I wondered. He enhanced my theologizing. Regardless of Wilson's own intentions, he deepened my faith in a marked way. An earlier turning point in my faith development had been when I was 20 and encountered the theologian Paul Tillich's God as the ground of all being, a helpful stepping stone beyond what then was in the culture, God as totally other and transcendent. But after a while, God as the ground of all being came to feel a little bit static and not lending itself very well to applicability to everyday life. Wilson's locating the religious impulse in our genes helped me. I could keep the symbol God as love with its hauntingly affectionate ties to my childhood and allow it to signify the sacred, not only as Most High, not only as the ground of all being, rather by appropriating an evolutionary understanding, God for me was now suddenly also experienced as the becoming of all being in a most tangible and immediate and image-evoking way. Out of this sudden intellectually provoked yet spiritual experience, it made perfect sense to me that of course we would find pointers to the holy in all aspects of our living, of our universe, from the very large to the very small, including in our genetic makeup, which carries the potential for prompting a way of being in the world which fills our lives with orientation and devotion, a way of being in which we might know, or at least intuit, what is ultimate and what is not. Here in our genetic makeup was encouragement toward rituals of creating what Mircea Eliade called sacred time and space in our lives, a break in the routine, a break in the profane, rituals of time and space in which we are reborn, like the time of the Iris Week in the space of Star Island. Well, after E.O. Wilson brought me to Star and the Iris Conference in 1984, the next year, 1985, I brought my then brand new husband, Frank, on the camera up there, to experience such wonderful wrestling with theology and science in the sacred time and space of this island. However, we spent much of that week in intense discussions of the sacred space of our one small and shared room. Which areas would be his to claim as sacred to mess up, as was his daily ritual, and which areas would be mine to tidy up, as was my daily ritual, and what did the intensity of our discussions point to for the future of our relationship. The next year, 1986, Frank stayed home. He decided that our relationship was secure enough that he could spend time working on his own career. Well, I had just finished my first year in full-time UU parish ministry in Amherst, Mass, and was feeling somewhat overwhelmed and engulfed by people. And so I was brought back to the Iris Week on Star Island by images of solitary walks, a room of my own in which to prepare the candlelight service which I had agreed to offer that week. I was exhausted from my first year of coming up with sermon topics, but a few weeks before the conference, Iris member and leader, some of you would have known her, Nancy Houck, called to see if I would lead an evening candlelight service. Frank answered the phone and actually took the question. Of course she would, I heard him say with great enthusiasm. The day before I left for the island, I realized that the service I'd hoped to adapt from a sermon I'd already done during that year to bring with me might not work, might be too removed from the events of the week. Oh well, I thought, my service is a few days off, and since I've requested a single room, I'll have plenty of time and solitude in which to come up with something new. And I proceeded to pack a small, literally, a small footlocker with the books that I'd bought related to the theme of that week, namely, free will. Is it possible and is it desirable? Now, Diana, also coming to the conference, and I were full-time ministers of UU churches in the same district and had each just finished our first year in those churches, though she had been a minister elsewhere for several years. We'd been on the fringes of friendship during that year and had agreed that if we ever had enough breathing room, we'd like to spend some time together. But she too was looking forward not only to the week of intense science and religion dialogue, but to having time alone. A respite from everybody is what I remember her saying. Well, Diana and I drove and talked our way to Portsmouth together, shared fast food and last-minute purchase of toiletries, and boarded the boat, shared a drink, and had our picture taken for the district newsletter back home. After we got to the island and checked in, we prepared to go our separate ways, to our solitary rooms, and agreed that sometime during the week we'd spend some time together. But I decided that before going to my room in Cottage D, I'd check out Diana's room in the hotel, just in case I wanted to know where she was. Well, where she was not alone. Her room was clearly set up for two people. Phew, I thought. I'm glad I requested a single, and that didn't happen to me. I proceeded confidently to Cottage D, knowing what it was like from the previous year's somewhat turbulent stay with Frank. However, when I opened the door to my room, I wasn't quite sure where I was. The room was clearly set up for two and potentially three people. 3 sets of towels, 1 single bed, and a double bed. I panicked and dashed back to find Diana in the hotel. Well, after Diana and I got the name of my one assigned roommate, Thelma, Diana devised a list of certain of my characteristics that might make Thelma want a different roommate. It wasn't hard to do. And starting with gets up at 4:30 in the morning. And so that Diana and I could be together. If we couldn't be alone, at least knowing one's roommate would make things a little easier. Well, as it turned out, my assigned roommate, Thelma, was extremely gracious about the change of arrangements. No list was needed, and Diana and I settled in for a week of solitude together. On Sunday morning of that week, I was wide awake at my usual time of 4:30, knowing again the service I brought with me would not work, and I'd better start writing a new one. Diana was snoring. I calculated I could reach my towel, shoes, writing things, and glasses and slip out without waking her, but where to go? I went to the hotel lobby. It was full, not like now. It was full of very noisy pelicans. I made my way out back on the rocks, looking for that big flat one I remembered. I found it and settled down. It began to rain. Writing, and realize this was 40 years ago, this was pen and paper. Writing in the rain was tricky. But I found that prayer and my morning yoga exercises on the rocks in the rain were at least workable. Finally, I decided I had had enough solitude and was in fact lonely. And I went back for 7 o'clock, now they have 5 o'clock coffee, went back for 7 o'clock coffee at the hotel and to bring some to my sleeping roommate. I returned to our room and found her, however, awake and into her own interesting morning meditation ritual. I could see that I really had something to learn from this one. I found out afterwards it's called Zen dressing. You stand poised in front of the closet, palms together, eyes wide open, emitting little sequential yelps until you are suddenly drawn to exactly the right outfit to wear for the day. I am not making this up. This was an inspiring ritual that I embraced, and honest to Pete, I use it to this day.
Do you yell?
Depends on who else is in the room, whether or not I yelp. Really, it's this kind of diversity and surprise in spiritual experience that have brought me back to the Iris Week on Star Island again and again. The surprise of spiritual experience, maybe we could call it grace. We're brought here by certain expectations which may or may not be fulfilled. But always, it seems to me, we are offered spiritual experiences which extend the boundaries of our expecting, of our faith, of our hoping, and of our loving. Well, Sunday evening that year in 1986, I skipped supper, I skipped social hour even, to work on my new Candlelight service in solitude. Diana returned to our room to find me on the bed, surrounded by the academic materials of the week, attempting to integrate into a half-hour evening service all the ideas of science and religion that I had hoped to make part of my ministry. I was seriously depressed and immobilized by not knowing how a minister, as lay scientist, could critically appropriate a scientific perspective for purposes of faith development. Diana, more experienced than I at that point, observed my despair and offered almost glibly, "Oh, don't worry about being stuck. That's just the Holy Spirit working." Surprisingly, as soon as she left, I began to write much of this now 40-year anniversary reflection. Many of us, I think, are brought here to Iris on Star Island by expectations of spiritual renewal through solitary or at least individualistic experiences, and yet many of us leave this week spiritually renewed and wiser through relational and communal experiences with each other, with the more than human animal life, with nature, with roommates even. Many of us, I think, are brought to the Iris Conference with expectations of new philosophical, spiritual, religious insights gained through a deep and scientific understanding of causality in the universe. Maybe we're drawn here because of what some of you will remember him, the late and longtime Irish leader and scientist Eugene de Quilly identified as our neurologically based yearning, quote, to orient ourselves rationally in what often appears to be a capricious universe. Yet many of us leave the Irish Conference with a deeper wisdom about who we are in the universe, not only because of science's causal explanations of answers to questions of why, but because of science's offerings which point to how we are to live in relation with one another, with all that is, even in the midst of uncertainty. We come here expecting to know why, and are met also by knowing how. That is, by faith, by hope, by love. Faith, I think, is our willingness to open to life's uncertainty even before we know why we are opening. Hope, I suggest, is our willingness to imagine that the sacred is birthing new life within us, between us, and among us in all the faces of reality, even before we understand why. Love is our responding, our moving toward that which needs us and which we need for the fulfillment of that hope. A willingness to move and to be moved even before we understand why. Certainly in 1986, I was drawn to have a particular roommate here this week, was called to move toward her and she toward me, well before we could understand why. Sometimes I still wonder what brings us to this place and to this time again and again. Holy and beautiful, the custom which brings us together in the presence of the Most High, to face our ideals, to remember our loved ones in absence, to give thanks, to make confession, to offer forgiveness, to be enlightened, and to be strengthened. Through this quiet hour breathes the worship of ages, the cathedral music of history. 3 unseen guests attend: faith, hope, and love. Let all our hearts prepare them place. May it be so. May faith in the spirit of life.
May faith in the spirit of life.
Hope for the community of earth.
Hope for the community of earth.
And love of the sacred in one another.
And love of the sacred in one another.
Be ours now and in all the days to come.
Be ours now and in all the days to come.
And let us sing together.